Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kashish Tomar, and I'm currently a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I have the honor of serving as the Master of Ceremony for today's event. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm and humble welcome to all in yet another informative session of our weekly Wednesday seminar titled Literary Activism in China in the 1980s and 1990s. Literature has always held a profound influence over society. In authoritarian regimes such as China, where freedom of expression and dissent is often suppressed, the importance of literary activism becomes even more pronounced. This presentation will explore the literary activism of two Chinese writers in the post-Mao period, namely Wang Anyi and Wang Shuo, mainly in two areas, that is class and gender. Some other concerns, such as traditions, social morality, and parental authority, will also be discussed by the speaker. The speaker for today's session is Dr. Manjurani Hara, who is an associate professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has recently submitted her PhD titled Literary Activism in China in the 1980s and 1990s, a case study of Wang Anyi and Wang Shuo. Her research interests are modern and contemporary Chinese literature, Chinese society and culture, and gender relations. The chair for today's session is Dr. Avijit Banerjee, who is a professor in Chinese and the head of Department of Chinese Language and Culture, Chin Bhavan, Vishwa Bharati University. He is also an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. He has several publications to his credit. He co-edited two books, India in the Eyes of the Chinese Youth and China Through the Eyes of the Indian Youth. His most recent publication is a translation of the book titled Doctor and Internationalist Dwarkanath Kotnis, a memorial volume from Bengali into Chinese. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants can be muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box during the event, or you can raise your hand during the interactive session. And after the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. We request you to mention your name and affiliation while you raise your question. That's all. I now hand over the floor to Dr. Avijit Banerjee to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Kashish, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome everybody here in this wonderful session, very interesting session. Manju will be talking, Dr. Manju will be speaking on this literary activism in China in the 80s and 90s. So we know that the societies in the entire world, we have seen that they are producing literature which are reflecting on the socio-economic, socio-political changes that are taking place in the society. Some societies we have seen are very open to this, and some society like China we have seen that which are not very open, but still some scholars, some writers have come up who has taken the space or who has used some of the space to reflect the views, their opinion. Now, socio-political changes had an impact on the social life and have been raised and discussed in various literary works. Now, in China, if we see, then literary activism has been one of the very important tools to express one's concern that is happening in his or her surrounding. Now, in China, we see that there are three, in the 20th century China, we have seen three periods. For example, if we see start from the Mayfourth movement, then till the Communist Party of China was established, or the People's Republic of China established in 1949. Then we see from the 1949 till the end of the Cultural Revolution, and then start the Tang era. Now, in all these periods, in the first period, if we see some of the debates that have taken place, and many important persons during that period, for example, Lu Xun, Mao Tun, Pa Qin, and many others, they had participated actively in this kind of literary debates. And this literature was definitely a tool, or we can say a very important weapon to enlighten the masses. Now, in the next period, if we see, then we find that during this, after this Mao era, we can see some of the literature was definitely produced because it was necessary for the politics, for the society. And in the third period, in which today Dr. Manju will speak, that is a very important period, we have seen various themes, new themes that have come up. For example, we have seen the scar literature, the reflective literature, the wénxué, the new realism literature, the root seeking, and also the women's literature. So, number of literature we have seen, these new themes have come up, which has uh, which has shown or described the plight or the sufferings of the people, the evil things of the society. Now, if we look at the first decade after the end of the Cultural Revolution, is likely as one of the most vigorous periods of cultural production in the 20th century China. Some people called it as the 80s. That means which started with the Deng Xiaoping's era of reform and opening up. The policy inaugurated a decade of exploration in ideology, culture, and economics, with China's turning from class struggle to economic construction or reconstruction. It ended decades of tyranny and isolation by opening China to the other side of the Cold War, that is, the capitalist world. As a result, tremendous vigor in cultural practice characterized the 80s. The previously censored modern Western culture gushed in and became suddenly accessible to ordinary Chinese readers. Newspapers and magazines were the major venues for cultural debates on topics such as humanism, democracy, and modernism. Literature and art played the leading roles in cultural reflection, reform, and creation. Indeed, the 80s and 90s saw rapid progression and immense changes in thoughts and cultural creation. In these senses, both cultural practitioners of the time and scholars thereafter have described the 1980s as an age of enlightenment. Nonetheless, the myth of the new enlightenment validated the ideological transition from class struggle to modernism in the immediate post-revolutionary era. It also justified the introduction of cultural products from the modern West, which included modernist aesthetics, the liberation of personal expression in literature and art, and potentially cultural capitalism. So, in this background, we are really very interested to hear from Manju about the literary activism in the 80s and 90s. Now, Manju, the floor is yours for your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kashish, Dr. Abhijit Banerjee. Thank you so much for giving the background, because Dr. Banerjee already has explained even the concept of activism or literary activism. So I'm thinking maybe I can skip, because there is a lot that I need to focus on in the 1980s. But lightly, just as a passing remark, literary activism is basically an active form of activism that is generated through through literature, especially in societies which are authoritarian in nature, such as former Soviet Union and China. Other societies, when we compare it with other forms of government, such as democracies, etc., civil society plays a very important role in the creation of many avenues of activism, such as judicial activism, political, social activism. But in authoritarian societies, as it has been seen, especially in Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Union and China's case, literary activism has been one method where people have taken up their issues concerning their lives or their surroundings, and call for their redressal. So that's by and large, I would say, about the explanation. And I would also skip the first part of the 20th century, because Dr. Banerjee anyway have discussed it. And I think also because from the point of, I can always come back to it in the Q&A session if people have questions or if I have more time. But from the point of view of literary activism, starting from the ancient period, there are very few examples of literary activism. And they are also sparse. They are also placed centuries apart. And I think one can only point out activism by Qu Yuan, which was from the Warring States period, by Pai Zhǔyì of Tang Dynasty. Mao Xiukui, a woman poetess that tried to look at men's plight, basically taking her own personal experience of her own husband, failed attempt at the imperial examination. So these were some of the very few examples of literary activism, but 20th century is abound, and it is filled with interesting phases of literary activism. May 4th period, as Dr. Banerjee just pointed out, is one of the first and a very significant period of literary activism, and especially the debates of 1920s and 1930s are very interesting to look at. But I can always come back to them later, because there is Lucian and Tingling and many other writers and thinkers that have contributed to these debates. But then my focus is going to be on 1980s, and specifically on these two writers, which is Anyi and wénxué, in the post-reform period. So if it is okay, I can just straight away talk about them. I will skip Yan'an talks as well, which were basically very important talks. Or maybe I can touch upon them, because I always feel that when we don't have the background, then it makes no sense for us to straight away jump to today's time. So Yan'an talks of 1942 are very important talks that were used as the literary guidelines for any sort of culture production and literary production. They discuss the role of literature and the relationship of literature and politics in great details. This is a time where Chairman Mao had urged the writers to study Marxism-Leninism, so that their erroneous views can be corrected, such as when writers were expressing and exploring universal human nature, or love in abstract, or freedom in abstract. During these talks, actually, many writers had engaged in detailed debates on these issues, and they were criticized, and there were attacks for their radical and non-conformist views, etc. And then we see a series of campaigns, political campaigns, such as Great Leap Forward, Pai Hua Yuntung, 100 Flower Movement, and after that, the Great Cultural Revolution, where we see a certain kind of activism that the literature was also used by the party to ensure ideological uniformity, to activate and influence the masses with revolutionary zeal. For an example, there were 8 model operas by Madame Jiang Qing that were staged in different locations in China, along with some select films and novels on the themes of heroism, and to do away everything that was feudal or bourgeoisie. And these operas were constructed on ideas such as glorification of PLA, People's Liberation Army. This basically had this kind of a political control, by and large, over literary creativity has by and large continued and remained the same until 1976, which was the end of Cultural Revolution. So one could see that in the process of consolidating political power, the party state had used literature to propagate certain political, social goal of the time. And therefore, it can be said that the literary activism of this period, which was the Mao period, was actually conditioned by the party state. And it had manifested itself through choices of themes and political perspective directed from above. Of course, there was a few exceptions in this period also, as also explained by Dr. Banerjee, which was High-Way Pakon, dismissal of High-Way from the office, or the young newcomer in organization department. But then these works that were exceptions, which were not towing along the party lines, were actually singled out for their unsponsored activism at the outset of the anti-rightist campaign and the cultural revolution. But when we see that the end of the cultural revolution and the ushering in of the Tang period, the party began to imply that the responsibility of the state was to expand socialist democracy rather than to exercise any kind of authoritarianism. Although they used the word socialist democracy, but then democracy was never defined in the Western terms. And it is in the post-reform period that we see that the Chinese Communist Party had provided some room for reconciliation between the state and the society by reducing the scope and arbitrariness of the political interventions into people's daily lives. This is also a time people were doing better economically. So with better purchasing ability, they could buy or sell stocks, they could buy any consumer goods. A general loosening of government control over daily life was a welcome change, and that ordinary masses were starting to feel a sense of ease and greater freedom in general to express, to consume, or to believe. This is a time that the Tang government, I'm talking about early 1980s, late 1970s, 1978, 79, that the Tang government had realized that the task of liberalization could not be achieved without the support of the intellectuals and writers. So one of the important policy measures that they had taken at this point of time was emancipation of mind, as the term in itself is self-explanatory, that the mind was set free. And that unnecessary unmeddling into the creative process by the party state was no longer the case, and literature witnessed unprecedented diversity in its content and themes. And there were many writers who started to delve into areas and issues that were considered forbidden into Mao's China. Nobody would look into personal, individual accounts, and collective was the only form that was welcomed into the literary creation. So when we look at this period, we see that literature was increasingly becoming concerned with humanitarian and social issues, and it was seeing a gradual distancing from the politics. And this is when we see a lot of genres and new literary trends coming up into Chinese literature. It started with Shanghan wénxué, scar literature, and then went on to new realism literature, which was in a way an extension of scar literature. The writers tried to influence social reality by attempting to change certain unhealthy and unacceptable tendencies into the system. Then reportage and truth-seeking literature, women's writings, and then also hooligan literature, because a part of my work is also going to cover hooligan literature. So I'll bring this up here. I'll also explain in a bit when I'm discussing Wang Anyi's work that how women's writing of 1980s were different in nature than women writings of, let's say, May 4th period, 1920s, etc. But these, in this period, when we see different genres and works, we see that a lot of writers were writing in support of and praising the values of universal human nature, and they advocated on creation of characters of flesh and blood with their defects and contradictions, which was not the case earlier with the communist regime. The socialist realism was a far cry from this kind of a literary creation. Universal human nature was an important concern that had surfaced in the Chinese literature during the early 1980s. Along the exploration into the human nature, we see the debates of humanism and alienation basically went hand in hand, and they emerged as two important concepts in literary exploration. There were debates in the early 1980s about where Wang wénxué and Zhou Yang and also Hu Qiaomu, very importantly, discussed alienation in how alienation can exist in socialist society. The wénxué actually sympathized with the masses and argued that Chinese socialist system has produced negatives like personality cult, irrational economic policies, bureaucratic indifference, corruption, privileges, selfish individualism, etc., which has inevitably created and bred alienation and diminished human worth. Some of the writers actually tried to look into psychological realism to explore issues of distorted humanity and alienated existence of individuals. One of the important points I would just mention here is that one of the speeches that, because we are talking about that how literary creation was different in this phase, was also because how leadership was also addressing the very task of literary creation. When Deng Xiaoping was addressing the writers, so there was a difference in how he addressed the people, a grouping of writers and artists, and his usage of the word people in place of the earlier coinage, which is workers, peasants, and soldiers, that had actually emphasized certain amount of integration of society in the eyes of the leadership, and that gave, one would like to believe that that gave Chinese writers and artists some sense of confidence, because in place of workers, peasants, and soldiers, Deng had repeatedly used people in place of that. I think with the widening income gap in this particular time period and changing social relations, now, gender relations were one of the areas that were being studied and observed. Chinese men and women both were fighting oppression. Like in most patriarchal societies where sexual division of labor gives birth or supports the sexual subcultures, men and women experience life differently. And with these, one could see the visible changes in the socio-cultural fabric of Chinese society. Many writers of this time actively engaged themselves in addressing issues of corruption, alienation, nepotism, etc., arising out of the changing social matrix, and they welcomed individualism in literary choices such as characterization, subjectivity of perception, and so on. Changes in social relations registered itself in many ways. Evident among them was the understanding of gender relations, which again found echo in the emerging body of women's writing. Now, these works experimented the body of women's writing, experimented with unconventional styles, and explored subject matters like traditional social conditioning, women's emancipation, female sexuality, and sexual morality with a gendered sensitivity. When we see Wang Anyi's works, we see that how one of the very critical or very important theme that stands out in her work when we talk about female sexuality or sexual morality is her understanding of the whole take on sexual love, that this sexual love as a complex phenomena of social transaction, and diluted historical and social elements into her works. So she explores issues of social taboo, among which sexual love was one of them. Her stories of it's called Love in Xiaocheng Zhilian, is a story of an unmarried young mother who eventually decides to be a single mother, a confident single mother. That's the way her character has been crafted. And in the narratives tradition of modern Chinese culture, if you see, it either sublimates love and sexuality, or it puts it into the abyss of sin. And Wang Anyi is a keen observer of psychosexual impulses of people. She takes a protagonist who is adolescent, and thereby she's also looking into how critical this stage of adolescence is, the adolescent sexual tensions, etc. Interestingly, both writers actually write about adolescent sexual tensions, and They've both had very similar sort of backdrop vis-a-vis Cultural Revolution. Then this novel's real innovation was not in its sexual exploration, but in Wang's personal exploration into human nature and human sexuality, where she acknowledges that sexual love can also be a very powerful force. And she provides rare psychological insights into the psychology of the two sexes and reveals the ways in which a society can repress your right to choose love freely. And when that power of love can turn destructive, that is to say, the sexual impulses of a man or a woman, they not just fight with the society's taboos or restrictions, but they also fight with their own reasoning. And it's these narratives are a far cry from the traditional view of women that limit women's urges to be motherly, benevolent, peacekeeping, or peaceful nature. Then in her another story, A Century on the Hill of Kangshang the Shuji, it's a story of a woman that is sent to the rural setting for labor, and she then finds herself in a place vis-a-vis a man who is, of course, in a hierarchically speaking, in a better position, and he has more political power to yield. So between this man and this woman that has come from the city to the rural setting for labor, she presents the contradictions between the politics and humanity. And more importantly, her story showcases the transcendence of human physical desire over laws of morality and laws of society. And in her, the way desire is written by Wang Anyi versus how desire is written by men is of course different, because when desire was rewritten from Wang Anyi's perspective, which is the perspective of a woman, and so the sexuality is presented as a natural trait all human possesses, irrespective of their gender. And the male characters are shown to have subverted the stalwart, strong positioning of men in Chinese society. Her men characters actually are selfish, cowardly, morally corrupt, fighting shy of familial or societal responsibilities. Not only they don't assume their familial social responsibility, but also persistently leave their lovers, their families, feeling disappointed. Women who have been shown to be traditionally protected by men are depicted tough and brave in her narratives. They not only have replaced men as the backbone of society, but in her works, they also shoulder every responsibility that just befalls on them by themselves. So here Wang Anyi moves away from socialist realist school of collective writing, which is 集体写作, and subscribes to more humanitarian themes of individual writing, which is 个体写作. And in all of these, she welcomes more of individual experience and subjective insight, of which women's consciousness is one of them. Also, it is evident that from the Mao period, that the Mao period actually theoretically gave women some relief in the sense of the struggle, the women's movement, and the struggle that they were going through, and the place that they wanted to reach, which is at a place of equality. But in that process, through the revolution, it desexualized them and stripped them of any feminine trait, dignity, or beauty, as women were encouraged to work, not only work, but even look like men. So while they were expected to work like men, Chinese women also faced a double jeopardy of losing their feminine grace and dealing with two workloads of work and home, like a category of work separately. So the whole idea of paid and unpaid labor. Now, how is Wang Anyi's work different from, since we were dealing with desire and sexuality, exploration of sexuality, there were other women writers like Chang Kang and Chang Che that in the post-reform period itself, in the reform period, that brought love into the mainstream Chinese literature, but they had steered clear of any sort of controversy by evading the sight of the body, the physical body, since their story did not involve any sexual love or the very right of it. Their works, to a certain degree, can be perceived as, in line with the anti-body position of the party. Wang Anyi's activism is of the kind where men and women complement and support each other. It does not separate men and women further. And some of the prominent issues that are very pronounced in her works is that she rejects sex politics, which is one of the things that stands out in Gangshang the Shiqi, A Century on the Hillock. She rejects sex politics for xíngdòng, a theme which was written about in the post-cultural revolution times. Though some of her works that appeared in the late 1980s, she normalizes sex as a natural trait, as a natural need, but she also became a critic of sex politics, and some of her works unravel the commonplace trait between political power and sex, like in the works like Gangshang the Shiqi and Chang Hanker, both The Century on the Hillock and The Song of Everlasting Sorrow. Like, for an example, like what is this commonplace trait that she is talking about is that in Gangshang the Shiqi, when this woman finds herself vis-a-vis her superior, Yang Shuo, so Li Xiaoqin, who only needs a recommendation letter, finds herself in a space because she understands that her team leader in the village likes her, and she can perhaps use that. So that's where the interface of power and political power and sex, that interface that she discusses. And she makes a point that women are not only entitled to. So some of these points that I'm referring to also are basically derived from the personal interview I had taken of Anyi in 2016. So women are not only, it's her view that they're not only entitled to, but also have the right to ultimate sexual satisfaction and happiness. Once again, it's a clear departure from the traditional discourse where women are portrayed as a passive or a tool for the male satisfaction. And she criticizes cultural revolution because for the harm that it had done to the human nature. And she's also in her works, when you would see, which is evident in many of her works, not just the 3 works that I had taken up as case study, that outside the sexual physiological needs, she shows that human beings have subtle other needs, such as the sense of belonging, sense of security, self-realization, and need for respect and love, etc. Very interestingly, these are some of these issues which are attached to or quite in connection with are considered as a very, very base of human nature, were also discussed by Lu Xun, I think way back in 1919. So when I was reading and I was listening to Wang Anyi, it was basically taking me back to Lu Xun and how some of these issues, some of the very basic issues like sense of belonging and sense of security, need for respect, etc., they are also very important human needs outside, the physiological or the sexual need. So that's one of the highlights that I had to make. And then in Chang Hanker, some of these works where she notices that or she depicts that patriarchal history is violent, and that women are its worst victims. Women anyway need to exert a lot to live tiniest bit of their dreams. But sometimes women don't have a choice. Like this is how Changhankar's story unfolds, that when Wang Qiyao, towards the late part of her age and late part of the novel, she does not have much control on how the history is unfolding. And sometimes women don't want to take part into the history, but the patriarchal history that she's narrating can walk up all the way to your doorstep, and women don't have a choice when and you inevitably become a victim of that history. Her novels also expresses a subtle dominance of both sexes and the struggle between men and women for social power. That I think I would not much highlight on, but while we are on Changhankar, I think the grand narratives that we see in Wang Anyi's work, I think that one needs to perhaps look into that. I was told at a point of time that Wang Anyi is not easy to read, because if you don't know the ongoing or the socio-political backdrop, then you will completely miss out on what is she conveying or what is she writing. So I think Wang Anyi does not deliberately express female consciousness frequently, but because her focus is also on, attention is also on the ever-changing social reality. And it must be pointed out that it constitutes the very strength and vastness of her historical narratives in her works, like the grand narratives that she has, and her women characters that runs you through these various stages of history. So her feminine consciousness is hidden into these grand narratives of vast history, and from gaps and corners of it, one can see it. Then I think I would probably now discuss Wang Shuo, because then I have to also bring them both together towards the end. So Wang Shuo is once again another interesting writer. There is a basic difference between these two, that Wang Shuo happens to be one of the first freelance writers in the Reform period. And that's a phase where you see shift of focus from politics to economy, that politics was no longer an overwhelming concern for people. It was actually the economy, and the newly introduced policies of material incentives were very encouraging for people. And it witnessed that how some of these basic economic strategies paved way for individual benefit and advancement, as economy became the only and overwhelming concern for both the party and the people. And Deng Xiaoping's one of the sayings where he said, let some get rich first. I think Deng implied this on that anybody who had the ability to create wealth was thinking perhaps in the process of creating wealth, they will not only help themselves, but also others to come out of poverty. But with this, let some get rich first, what we had seen was that a lot of people started to use moral and immoral means, all sorts of means, to get rich first. The people made efforts for individual benefits or to get rich first. And therefore we see a transformation in a huge middle class. Some people call it middle class, but going by the purchasing abilities that they have or employment, etc., some parameters, I think it can be called a lower middle class for the ease of explanation. This was a class that Wang Shuo found himself to be fascinated with, or he wanted to represent this class. This is the class that used every means to get rich faster. And that has not only fascinated Wang Shuo as a writer, but many other writers also. But Wang Shuo uses characters from this peripheral socio-economic stratum to artistically capture and represent the emergence of a different kind of a class. Once again, I had 3 case studies for Wang Shuo as well. And the concerns in his works also were sort of overlapping. There were class, gender, many other things that were there in each work, if one was to see. We can see that through Wang Shuo's work that there is a deliberate renegotiation of the established literary styles and norms that he does not succumb to, meaning that he did not succumb to the old existing literary practices. And why I'm saying this is that because Wang Shuo's characters happens to be these this particular socioeconomic grouping that he's representing is a grouping of what we call fringes of the society that are small-time criminals. They're basically small-time criminals. They're not into big crimes like murder, abduction, nothing of that sort, but peddling goods from here to there, taking it to South because South was making more money. It was more developed than the inlands, or small-time thieves, etc. And they have a very typical traits of tall talks, etc. Womenizing, and they operate into gangs or groups, swindling and gambling, and these are very typical traits of this particular class. Now, why he was why one would say that he was renegotiating the established literary styles is because before Wang Shuo, nobody even thought of picking up a hero or a central figure from this particular peripheral stratum. Nobody would want, as in Chinese we say "pian yuan ren," which are literally on the edge. So nobody wanted a central figure or their protagonist to be from there, and so therefore Wang happens to be one of the unique writers. And the literature in 1980s and 1990s basically had observed two large trends that dominated the intellectual and cultural world. That while the Enlightenment movement of 1980s was perceived as elite and ideal with a definite political consciousness, 1990s saw a rise of the consumerist popular culture, which was more materialistic and apolitical. So when we see the rise of Wang Shuo, who's representing anti-intellectual wave of popular consumer, this is how popular consumerism, because all his works were seen as not serious works of literature by the stalwarts and the orthodox thinkers and writers. That indicates that China's social and cultural transition into a highly commercial consumerist society of 1990s. But by refusing to conform to the dictates of existing literary tradition, Wang has not only rejected the authority of socialist realism, but he has also pushed the literary boundaries to define a new sort of a modernism in literature. Now, when we see these characters of Wang Shuo in his works, we see that these group of youngsters that often form into gangs, and these group of marginal people, these youngsters that are going to south of China to take part in the gold rush. As the economy developed faster in Hong Kong and Guangdong as a result of the open door policy. But this is an empathetic view that one can take, that behind the facade of materially driven and pleasure-seeking young generation, Wang was trying to portray a life that was constantly swinging between extremities of depression, excitement, and chaos. In his representation of the youth, the so-called lost generation, as they were called everywhere, the lost generation, he brings in the element of sexual tension and physical desire as well, to highlight that this generation grew up in an environment of endless propaganda and campaigns for the Cultural Revolution, Wang being one of them himself. So a lot of his works, basically, you see a bit of reflection of his own life. So in that environment, when these youngsters had grown up with propaganda and campaigns for Cultural Revolution, and whichever way Cultural Revolution ended, they lost their idealism and confidence in the political leadership, and also to an extent a human trust. Now, whatever appears real to them, anything that appears real to them is their physical desire. That's the closest they get, and the only people they can trust is themselves. It is through works of Wang Shuo that terms like Liu Mang and Pizza, because these are the words. His literature is called Liu Mang wénxué. Liu Mang is the word for hooligan. That reached a common man's understanding. This is to assert basically that the common man before this did not see Liu Mang as a natural social phenomena of society that is embracing capitalist culture or capitalist ethics. In a rapidly changing society, this new class was only looked at as, as I said, the marginalized people were as criminals or social outlaws. But with Wang Shuo's works, this social grouping found a new changhu with a addressal as, let's say, isolated youth, loners, rebels, or even unprincipled entrepreneurs. So Wang's depiction of this new class helps one reach an empathetic understanding of this so-called unpleasant, uncultured strata of society. And then at a point of time, I would now try and bring how Wang Anyi and Wang Shuo both have tried to, apart from their dominant writing style or dominant literary trend, they have also explored other concerns in their work, of course, with intersecting affiliations. That is to say, when Wang Anyi was writing about women, she had explored class issues as well. And then if similarly goes for Wang Shuo, that he has certain understanding and how he characterizes his women characters. But also if there are other concerns that these two have explored. At this point of time, of course, there is a lot of theoretical understanding I had to myself reach to understand gender ideology and foundation of women's oppression, and whether patriarchal structures existed independently from those of capitalism. But I think I will leave out this theoretical part because I have to again come back to Wang Anyi and Wang Shuo's work and focus on. But I think when we look at 20th century, it is for us to understand that the Chinese thinkers, writers, and theoreticians were thinking about these two questions of class and gender from the very time that they became intellectually aware of these two concepts, right? So the views of Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, Liang was using the principle of profit to explain that how women are consumers and dependent, and that's the cause for national inferiority. But he, of course, do not make any case for women that were housewives. Before that, most women were homemakers, so he does not mention any of that. And he highlights that their education is important, as only the mother can take advantage of this particular education and the skill to guide her children. Then there are Jin Tianhe, Chen Xiefeng, Qiu Jin, He Yingzhen, etc. Those are all discussed where, to discuss that when women were trying to come out of Sushi Tongtang kind of a family, which is 4 generations under one roof, they were actually actively, consciously thinking of ideas whether women as individuals can take decisions of their own lives, such as decisions on education, the right to choose their own partner, employment, etc. And that is also to say that beyond the roles assigned to women by traditional family structure, think of reproduction or the concept of work going beyond reproduction, childbearing, looking after the family. What more roles and what more hats can women don? Now, women writers were criticizing the public-private equation, which was strictly used to doubt women's abilities, etc. The concept of women working as a private person inside the home, and the category of work in which they can they are able to contribute in the production of wealth, and that whether they can be a part of creation of wealth in the public space. So May 4th movement brought up all these changes, and when May 4th movement was a cultural rejection of their own system of governance, politics, and orthodox thinking, as they tried looking for answers for their own problems. Then I think what I could mention here is this will, May 4th period, I can discuss more of it. But maybe I will leave out that Marxist framework because that provided a lot of answers, and that's why China decided to adopt socialism after the May 4th movement. The Chinese intellectual actually had also tried to explore ways of reconciling the two ideologies in the Chinese struggle for national liberation. That is to say, the issues of, one can hypothetically think issues of class and gender as Marxism and feminism. But they realized that the Chinese national liberation was not only a liberation from the clutches of imperialist forces, but China was also looking to liberate itself from the existing forces of semi-feudal social structures that had deeply embedded and intertwined issues of class and gender. So let me, I think, straightaway come to this interface of Wang Shuo, like how, apart from class, how he has crafted his women characters. And then I'll come to Wang Anyi. So Wang Shuo's description of his women's images, promiscuous or pure, he has both. He has assigned supporting roles to women, and some of these women are also the gang members. They are also some kind of gangsters. But there are few of them, of course, but then nonetheless, there are women characters like that, and symbolizing the prevalent gender relations and the state of affairs in China, as well as his depiction of adolescent sexuality, which are again phenomenal. That Wang's depiction as to how their generation wrestled with anxieties and conflicts that came along adolescent sexuality was one of the first times that such a theme could find portrayal in Chinese literature. With the explicit narratives of self-indulgent and lecherous young Chinese men that think it is glorious to be debauched and violent, Wang Shuo is signaling towards degeneracy of Chinese youth. And Wang Shuo breaches a moral and ideological code of conduct by going against the rhetoric of the communist virtue of showing restraint or making sacrifices. And at the same time, he disregards Confucian traditional mindset with scornful account of chastity of Chinese women. And there are many words that through, especially in one novel, that depict ideas and thoughts through certain aspects of women's bodies. They are not, these words or these terms are not a part of this, but if somebody is interested, I can share them. They're part of my thesis as well. The nationalist discourse on China has one such tradition where female chastity is associated with that of the honor, integrity, and morality of Chinese civilization, usually in direct portion. Though this convention had its roots long before the advent of nationalist movement in China. Chinese women has served as a potent symbol of purity and goodness. That is the understanding of Chineseness through the times. The tendency to depict women as embodying the eternal Chinese civilizational virtues. When writers like Wang Shuo mentions corrupted female, so no matter how harmless or mild it may seem, it may be symbolic of an aggressive critique of the corruption of the party or of the nation, because such a notion not only undermines the moral authority of the Chinese state, but it also confronts the fundamental notions of Chineseness. Wang Shuo's very ambivalence to maintain consistency, which was also a little confusing to me when I read him first, that he did not maintain consistency in his women images. That can be alluded to his own skepticism concerning the overall health of the nation. And in this regard, the images of women can be seen to symbolize the state of affairs of his countries. Then on the issue of class, that how Wang Anyi presents class in her work. We know that in the post-reform period, the literature moved away from black and white depictions of earlier understanding of bourgeoisie, proletariat class. That was the understanding of class, but in the post-reform period, it became much nuanced, socioeconomic. I mean, it became a much more layered, and there were many socioeconomic classes. And therefore, that's the larger difference of how we experience class in the reform China and in the Mao period. Apart from the sex called the xíngdòng that she rejects in her works, apart from that, I think women, Wang Anyi basically portrays that how women, when they belong to different classes, they face exploitation, sometimes based both on their gender as well as on the.
Just one thing, can you come to the conclusion?
Okay, I have taken more time.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm very much towards the end. It's just Wang Anyi's part that I want to finish with.
Right.
Maybe 3 minutes, if it's okay.
2-3 minutes. 2-3 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So it's a unique form of corruption in their system, but it also first alienates women on the ground of class, and then on the basis of gender. Maybe not particularly in this sequence. And then Wang Anyi, some of the works, I'm forgetting the names. I think one of them is called Qiangji, and another is called Life in a Small Courtyard. It actually, in Life in a Small Courtyard, I think have two characters, Aping and Huang Jian. And then the woman character, Song Song, is basically confused between the two. So why she would choose one who is the son of a rich father who has more political power to yield, versus the other one who is, I think, Aping, who has read classical texts, and he basically sometimes reads these texts to her. And so she decides to be with this person who is more culturally endowed. So therefore, when there is this, when we are discussing class, I thought maybe I can make a little point about that, how Wang Anyi assigns class to people that are more culturally endowed. And she makes a special case for intellectuals, meaning that they are deserving of all the respect. And she herself had that background. So therefore, that's where she designates more class to culturally elite people. But when it comes to Wang Shuo, I think he does not make any case for culturally elite people. In fact, many of the writers, because he received a lot of cold treatment from the literary establishment and a lot of criticism from that particular segment of society. He mocks many writers and many political leaders as well. But his background, because his father was a physician and therefore they used to live they had certain political power to yield, at least in the past. So indirectly, he talks about political elite, but he has no place for either of these two. He only says that the only people that should have class or would have class would be the people that are extremely well off. So economically well off people, that is to say, social elite. So coming back to class and gender, I think perhaps when the Chinese writers in their first encounter with these two concerns, I think there was no novelty or shock value when the issues of class and gender first found mentioned in the literary writings. But it is another truth that the writers may not have newly been introduced to these two concerns. But at the same time, they admit and acknowledge that the problems of class and gender were deeply embedded into the mainstream Chinese thought and culture. And the literary works of these two writers stands a testimony to this reality. There is a few points more that I could have added, but I'm just skipping them, and maybe I can take them up in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Kashish, just see the question answer or some comments.
Yes, sir. So as of now, we do not have any questions. So I would request all the participants, if they have any questions that they want to direct towards Dr. Manjurani Hara, you can please just type it in the chat box or raise your hand and we will unmute you.
That was too much, I think.
So until we wait for some questions to come up, would Dr. Avijit Banerjee like to engage in a dialogue with?
Yeah, I think Manju, you have touched all the things of the 80s and 90s wonderfully. You have come from the background also. You have not dealt much with the background, but you know, we have seen from how this in the Mao period, from Mao period, it has come to the 80s and 90s. We have seen Wang Anyi. Wang Anyi, we can say also that Wang Anyi probably represents the generation of writers whose formal education was disrupted, we have already said, during the Cultural Revolution period, and probably was the most widely read and anthologized authors of the post-Mao era, and a breaker of the taboos and a speaker for China's younger generation, isn't it? Because you have correctly pointed out, and Wang Anyi also, you have correctly mentioned that he has seen women in a different way. He has depicted women in a different way. Wang Shuo also. Wang Shuo that you mentioned just now, that Wang Shuo probably highlighted the darker side of the society, and I think there is a gap between the more younger generation and the traditional communist leaders. It also tried to mention there is a gap between the younger generation, and because society was changing, this 80s and 90s, we have seen society changing, and they are more brave. We are talking of Wang Anyi and Wang Shuo. Some others were also there, were more brave in depicting the changes in the society. I think wonderful. You have dealt everything in a very nuanced way, in a wonderful way, and definitely, yeah.
So we do have a question.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes. So you can just unmute yourself, Ms. Anantagiri, and please also mention your affiliation. Sorry, Mr. Anantagiri. My bad. Yes.
Hello, ni hao, good afternoon. I am Ananta Kumar Giri from the Madras Institute of Development Studies. So nice listening to you and Professor Banerjee. Now, I have joined your presentation, possibly from the half of it, being on the road. But I have a few queries. One is in these literary works, in portraying the characters, what are the inner conflicts the characters go through. It seems your presentation presented in a very smooth manner. My request is that the kind of conflict of, the inner conflict, the desire and norm, like you mentioned, a woman, she sees that the village team leader likes her and maybe she could give him sexual favor. But all these activities, are they isolated from any kind of inner conflicts? And the wider inner conflict of society also, even the new generation of capitalistic culture. Now, how does it interact with the sense of life? See the dialogue between the I and the we, and this dialogue happening at the conjunction of different cultural influences, the Chinese culture, Western culture, and the broader translational global culture. Thank you for your consideration.
Yeah, will you want to respond?
Yeah. May I ask you to repeat your second question where you are asking me about dialogue between I and we? Can you elaborate what specifically would you like to know? That how are they engaging in the dialogue of I and we?
Yes, like this me generation and the young generation that mainly focused on me, the I, but they have their own life world of many we, whether it is an immediate relationship of love or the family that they come from, or even nature. What is missing is any concern for nature, for example. And I know that, for example, in China, with all challenges, building an ecological civilization is part of the Chinese constitution. So I was wondering whether in her work there is any sensitivity either to the destroyed nature or to the created nature, Yes.
Okay, the second question is a very interesting question, but I don't know if I would be able to answer that, because the ecological civilization, it's okay, right, that I take the second question first, because the ecological civilization, I think, is a relatively newer concept, and my work is on 1980s and 90s. So from this perspective, I won't be able to tell you that how they are, whether or not they have any concern for nature. But if you're simply looking to understand I and we in the framework of 1980s and 90s, I think my presentation had made that point that individualism and individual thought and subjectivity of perceptions were the things that found a lot of welcome in the post-reform period, which was not the case. So it felt like they had been repressing a lot of feeling and emotions of their own, or the agony and turmoil that they had gone through by way of cultural revolution. And suddenly there was a door that was opened, and through literature they were able to address everything that was pent up inside. And in that phase of 1980s and 90s, we don't see a lot of we narratives. Many of these, especially these two writers that I am working on, or I have worked on, basically write from even though their works may not necessarily be the I narrative, which means that they are trying to they're trying to look or sound like autobiographical or semi-autobiographical, but the idea of we was sort of left behind. I think that's where I will leave that, because I don't think I'm equipped to answer vis-a-vis your ecological civilization thing. Is I'll have to study for that. But the inner conflicts, that's a good question, and I think I can relate to that, and I can perhaps deal with that. So as I said, that in the reform period, writers were thinking of creating characters of flesh and blood with all their contradictions and all their defects. specifically speaking of their characters or the way they characterize their men and women characters. So this particular woman that you are talking about, Li Xiaoqin from Kangshan Shiji, so her inner conflict, as you asked, is basically not to give in, because to begin with, nobody wants to, you don't wish to welcome anybody's advances unless you really, you reciprocate somebody's feeling, which was not the case. So she obviously did not want to give in. And so there is a narrative about that part where she's feeling conflicted. And in fact, to an extent, she also discusses, because Wang Anyi has never shied away from, as I said, discussing the sight of body. So even when they're discussing a man, she very openly says that she is disgusted by his look. So physical aspects of, or the physical beauty of the man is also discussed. And but she's conflicted because she wants that recommendation letter so that she can make her way back to the city life, and she did not want to be in the rural setting. So those are the places that she is conflicted at, and somehow they both enter into a relationship. There are other inner conflicts if one was to see from maybe Wang Shuo's aspect, because I just discussed Wang Anyi. So Wang Shuo's characters also men characters or women characters, but larger part of his narration about the men characters, Fang Yan for that matter, whenever he is mean to a woman, so there's a lot of afterthought that he has. So these kind of narratives are there, that how he feels that he is being horrible to the person. So there are inner conflicts among many characters that that have been discussed in their works. Have I answered your question, sir?
Any other, I think.
Thank you so much. Xie.
There is another question.
In the chat, I am trying
to
see.
Yes, so there is another question that is posted in the chat box. This is by Mr. Shanki Chandra. He's asking, what are the main differences between post-2000 literary activism in China, particularly in the context of class and gender, and the key trends that shaped it in the 1980s and 1990s?
Okay, I once again think that this is something that I will have to study, because I have not studied after of the 20th century developments. But plainly, I could say I won't be able to explain that in respect of class and gender, but I would perhaps from the surface level be able to say that these issues nonetheless remain even today. And even in the 21st century, you will see that there is existence of literary activism, and men and women are engaging into, from different perspectives into different issues, class and gender always being one of them. But I may not exactly be able to pinpoint, because I'm really sorry I have not. This is something that I was thinking to take up later as like something like an extension of my thesis, is like, so that it is more updated and it is more relevant to people when they read it today. But literary activism is not going anywhere. It is definitely part of Chinese society. We see 2013's speech by, I think it was 2013 speech by President Xi, where he is asking the writers to write good stories of China, right? Read a good story of China. So that is basically a directive that is coming from the top to tell writers that we must present the positive images and positive stories of China, and those stories should be circulated. But what remains to be seen is that how many writers, there will definitely be writers that will engage into this, but there will always be other literary trends and discourses that will run parallel to that. because the society at large will always have certain issues. We have seen protests, which was once again, when I was in the beginning trying to say that authoritarian societies do not really have much scope for political social activism. But in the very recent years, we see that the real estate related protests, and we have seen protests during and towards the end of the COVID period, right? So those are some of the new developments that are happening. But with those, literary activism will always exist, and that is going to be the case for China. Yeah, Shanki, that is how I would answer your question.
We have to come to the end, so I think just a quick look at Usha's question. If you just in a word, in a sentence, you want to answer, or
at the end,
in the say Wang and Wénxué depict sexuality.
Yes, ma'am. So Dr. Usha Chandan is asking you if there is any difference in the way Wang, Anyi, and Wénxué depict sexuality.
There is.
And another addition to the question is, does Wang Anyi bring out women's sexuality more explicitly, and did Wénxué also do the same in his narrative?
So the only difference, as one could see, is that first of all, they do bring out men and women's sexuality very openly, because even Wang Anyi writes about men and women's sexuality. There are extramarital affairs that she has written about in the Love trilogy, and there are explicit details of those. The only difference that I can see in the narration of these explicit details is that when Wénxué discusses or presents women characters indulging into some such act, or when they are trying to explore their sexuality, women characters are portrayed in a certain it is both the purity of a woman is shown as in a completely different way. There is a character Paishan when he says she's her beauty or her character and her nature is as pure as the dew, the word called dew. So he talks about purity of somebody's character, but at the same time he also has this promiscuous women. So when he presents them, as I said, that the only difference is that he tries to hold them up as some sort of a parameter, some sort of a point of reference or point of comparison to the how pure the Chinese nation is, because their honor is directly proportionate to Chinese civilization. So that is the only thing. When Wang Anyi is discussing women and her sexuality, it is shown as something which is a natural trait. As I said, that there is nothing evil, or that sexual love is not an evil force. It is not something that to be afraid of, or that we should vilify. She accepts sexuality as a very natural trait of human being, or of being a woman. And I think that is one, without actually creating it as a metaphor or any kind of a parameter to come to a certain conclusion to judge a particular country's morality, or it's not really used as a moral compass as it is sometimes used in Wénxué's case. That is one thing I can definitely point out. That is where I think these two people are different.
I think there is no more questions or comments.
So I believe there are no more questions in the chat box.
So thank you all the participants, and wonderful deliberation by Dr. Manju. And really, we have seen that many of the themes which are banned, we can say the modernism which was banned since 1949, came back to China with a new vigor or with a redoubled impact. And we have seen many of the authors, and we have mentioned about Wang Anyi, Wang Shuo, we can see Wang Mang, Shen and many others, who wrote the novels, short stories, and tales, and depicted the socio-economic, political changes, the income disparity, and many other things that are now present in the Chinese society. So this discussion, I think, is not that we can limit within an hour. It will continue, and I also thank ICS for bringing up such an important topic, and hope that in future also this kind of discussion will continue in this platform. Thanks everybody. Thanks Kashis for your help in organizing. Thanks Professor Alkacharya and others. Also all the participants. Once again, I thank Dr. Manju for your wonderful lecture. Thank you all. So I think we can end here. Yeah, Kashis.
Yes, sir. Since we have received your permission to formally bring an end to today's session, so now we are wrapping up the seminar for today. And we thank Dr. Manjurani Hara and Dr. Avijit Banerjee for giving us your precious time and gracing the seminar with your valuable insights. The video of today's seminar, it can be found on our YouTube platform. And we would also like to welcome you all for our next Wednesday seminar, which is titled Beyond Borders, Chinese Demographic Chessboard and Implications for Global Diplomacy. Information related to the same will be available on the ICS website, or you could also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. That would be